Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's event. My name is Leanne Quinn, and I am the Program Assistant for the Chemical Weapons Convention Coalition. So we appreciate all of you tuning in, and we hope that you'll find today's program engaging and informative. So before we begin, I'd like to take a brief moment to thank Global Affair Canada's Weapons Threat Reduction Program, as well as the Arms Control Association for their continued support. So today's program will focus on the past, present, and future of the use and regulation of central nervous system acting chemicals, also known as CNS-acting chemicals. Our event will begin with a brief introduction by CWC Coalition Coordinator, Dr. Paul Walker. Dr. Walker will provide background and context regarding the ongoing debate surrounding CNS-acting chemicals in the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, also known as the OPCW. Following Paul's remarks, we are lucky to have two speakers, Dr. Malcolm Dando and Dr. Michael Crowley, who have dedicated a significant portion of their careers to studying today's topic. Robert Matthews was unable to attend today due to a scheduling conflict. Following Malcolm and Michael's presentations, we will have a question and answer segment. Please use the Q&A section and not the chat function to submit any questions that you have, and we will try our best to answer as many as we can. So without further ado, I am pleased to welcome Dr. Paul Walker. Paul is the Vice Chair of the Arms Control Association Board of Directors, the coordinator of the Chemical Weapons Convention Coalition, and the director of Green Cross International's Environmental Security and Sustainability Program. Paul received the Right Livelihood Award in December 2013 for his tireless dedication to rid the world of chemical weapons. Paul, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Leanne, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever everybody is worldwide. I know we have a very large number of attendees today, so I'm delighted to see you all, and I know we're going to have a very interesting and productive discussion today. We're delighted to be able to organize and host the second webinar of the Chemical Weapons Convention Coalition, also known, as many of you know, as the CWC Coalition or the CWCC. As many of you may be aware, our first CWC Coalition webinar this year was on the results of the 25th CWC Conference of States Parties, CSP 25, as we all call it, last November and December, and continued this past April due to the pandemic. It was split in half, as you remember. It included OPCW Director General Fernando Arias, German Ambassador Gudrun Lingner, Canadian Ambassador Lisa Helfand, and Dr. Jean-Pascal Zanders from Belgium, and is available still for everybody to view on the web. We're very happy that we've been able to organize our second CWC Coalition webinar today. We would also note that today, June 29th, is the 34th anniversary of the major chemical weapons attack by Saddam Hussein on Sadasht in Iran, along the Iran-Iraqi border. The Sadasht victims still suffer the long-term effects of toxic chemical agents today, actively participate in our coalition and have for years, and have spoken several times in The Hague about their ongoing challenges, mostly medical challenges. We'll send them our best wishes, and we will continue our efforts to help all victims of chemical warfare, and likely actually we'll have a webinar on victims of chemical warfare in the near future. The issue today of central nervous system acting chemicals is not a new issue. And it's been raised at the annual OPCW conferences and at Executive Council sessions a number of times. I recall personally when the International Committee of the Red Cross sought to raise this issue in 2008, 13 years ago, at the second review conference in The Hague. It was also raised that year by our late colleague, Julian Perry Robinson, as an existential issue for both the CWC and the BWC. Switzerland also raised the issue in 2008 and has called on the CWC states parties to clarify what is prohibited and not prohibited for aerosolized CNS-acting chemicals. It was one of the very first issues which the CWC coalition raised in a side event in The Hague in both 2010 and 2015. Australia also became an advocate for addressing this issue by 2014 and probably earlier still. And several dozen countries joined in several years later. A draft decision thereon with many co-sponsors was part of the last Executive Council session, EC 96, and is now being raised at next week's 97th OPCW Executive Council session, July 6th and 9, just a week from now. So we are very fortunate to have both Dr. Malcolm Dando and Dr. Michael Crowley from Britain to speak on this issue. In fact, I believe that they both may have spoken at our CWC Coalition side event a decade ago on CNS-acting chemicals, as well as on riot control agents, RCAs, and incapacitating chemical agents, ICAs. Some refer to some of these chemicals as lethal and non-lethal, and most of us, I think, agree that that's really not an appropriate discussion. But both Malcolm and Michael will get into that. They will explain all of this much better than I can, of course. So I turn the program back to Leanne to introduce them both. I will return after their presentations to moderate our discussion. So please let us know your questions in the Q&A function, as Leanne pointed out, at the bottom of your screen, and we will try to get to as many of them as possible after the two presentations. So I'll turn the podium back to Leanne Quinn right now. It's yours, Leanne.
All right, thank you very much, Paul. So I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Michael Crowley. Dr. Crowley is an honorary visiting research fellow at the University of Bradford in the United Kingdom. He is also a senior research associate at the Omega Research Foundation and previously held positions at the Verification Research Training and Information Center, also known as VERTIC, and the British American Security Information Center, also known as BASIC. Dr. Crowley's recent work has explored mechanisms for the regulation of riot control agents, incapacitants, and related means of agent delivery. So Michael, the floor is yours, and let me pull up your slides.
Great. Many thanks, Leanne, and thanks to Paul for organising this important and well-timed CWC Coalition webinar, and for inviting me to join you. In my presentation, I'll try to describe central nervous system acting chemical weapons, explore their alleged utility, highlight the contrasting dangers to health, national and human security, provide an overview of Cnsac research of concern, and finally share some thoughts on how this issue could be addressed by the OPCW. Okay, the weaponized use of central nervous system acting chemicals, or Cnsac weapons, is of long-standing concern, as Paul said. These weapons have many alternative names, including knockout gases, calmatives, immobilizing agents, incapacitants, pharmaceutical-based agents, and pharmacological non-lethal weapons. However, there's currently no agreed definition of Cnsac weapons, or the other synonyms, under the Chemical Weapons Convention, and no authoritative list of Cnsacs of particular concern. So, as a provisional working description for this presentation, Cnsac weapons can be considered as employing a disparate range of toxic chemicals, potentially including pharmaceutical chemicals or bioregulators or peptides that are purportedly intended to act on the body's core biochemical and physiological systems, most notably the central nervous system, to cause prolonged but non-permanent disability. They include centrally acting agents producing sedation, hallucination, incoherence, disorientation, paralysis, or loss of consciousness. In practice, due to low safety margins of the agents, their use can result in serious injury or death. There's a wide variety of agents that have been explored or could potentially be utilized as Cnsac weapons, with interest concentrated upon a range of pharmaceutical chemicals, including anesthetic agents, skeletal muscle relaxants, opioid analgesics, anxiolytics, antipsychotics, antidepressants, and sedative hypnotic agents. Now, many of these are currently legitimately utilized by the medical or veterinary professions. It's important to clarify from the very start that Cnsacs are toxic chemicals and as such are regulated under the Chemical Weapons Convention. Their development, acquisition, stockpiling, transfer, or use would be permissible only for purposes not prohibited, and only when the types and quantities of such toxic chemicals were consistent with such purposes. Now, this means that any employment of Cnsac weapons in armed conflict is absolutely prohibited under the CWC. However, there have been differing interpretations as to whether and in what circumstances such toxic chemicals could be employed for law enforcement purposes. It's also important to note that Cnsac weapons are completely distinct from riot control agents, RCAs, tear gases and pepper sprays, which act peripherally, notably on the mucous membranes, respiratory tract and the eyes, with their effects normally disappearing within a short time following termination of exposure, provided they're not used in excessive quantities. And unlike Cnsacs, RCAs are specifically defined under the CWC. While their use in armed conflict is prohibited under the CWC, the use for law enforcement of RCAs is allowed, but only provided that the types and quantities are consistent with such purposes. So these are two completely different classes of chemicals. So back to Cnsac weapons. Proponents of these weapons have long promoted their development and use in certain law enforcement scenarios, for example, to respond to hijackings and armed sieges where hostages have been taken and there's a perceived need to incapacitate everybody in the room. They have also been raised as a possible tool in a variety of military operations, especially in locations where fighters and civilians are in close proximity or intermingled. Next slide, please. Yeah, thank you. So in contrast to the proponents of these weapons, a broad range of observers, including scientific and medical organizations, such as the British Medical Association, have criticized Cnsac weapons, contending that the use of these weapons, particularly when aerosolized, presents potentially grave dangers to health and well-being of those targeted. Particularly because, as I said earlier, these agents have very low safety margins. In practice, there would be uneven dissemination of the agent in enclosed spaces. There would be a variability in the human response due to age, size, and underlying health issues. And because of the tactical need to rapidly to have rapid onset of action, it's very likely that the law enforcement organizations would use very large amounts of the agent, which of course would increase the likelihood of serious injury and death. So as well as those health concerns, there are a range of other concerns. Next slide, Leanne, please. And those include the risk of creeping acceptance and legitimization of Cnsac weapons as the norm against the weaponization of toxicity is gradually eroded. The dangers of both horizontal and vertical state proliferation, i.e. to increasing numbers of states and to more and more actors within each state. For example, a Cnsac weapon may be initially developed and held and argued for use only by a state's anti-terrorist forces. But then if it's deemed to be successful, it may spread to other police, security and military forces within the state. There's also the danger of acquisition by non-state actors, including private security forces, criminal organizations and terrorists. There's also the potential use of such weapons together with firearms to make firearms more effective, so that these Cnsac weapons act as lethal force multipliers. Concerns have also been raised about their employment to facilitate torture and other ill treatment, including coercive interrogation. And the concern that when you start research and development of these weapons, it will encourage further militarization and misuse of the life sciences, and Malcolm will speak about that. There's also the potential for states to use law enforcement Cnsac weapons development as a cover for covert offensive chemical weapons programs. And finally, the danger of creating a slippery slope that could eventually lead to chemical warfare. Next slide, Leanne, please. Now, in the light of these concerns, over the last few years, Malcolm and I have investigated research potentially applicable to the study or development of Cnsac weapons that has taken place since the Chemical Weapons Convention came into force in 1997. And further information has been uncovered by other researchers and the media, and certain countries have documented their concerns as well. To date, the only confirmed large-scale use of an aerosolized Cnsac weapon has been by Russian security forces in their attempts to free approximately 900 hostages held by heavily armed Chechen separatists in the Dubrovka theater in Moscow in October 2002. Now, although the hostages were released, over 120 of them died as a result of the toxic effects of the Cnsac weapon employed or from airway constriction due to their incapacitation. An undetermined additional number of hostages reportedly suffered long-term health damage or died prematurely in the years after the siege. The Russian authorities have never publicly identified the specific Cnsac weapon used, nor provided details of relevant research and development activities or of any existing weapons stockpiles. Next slide, please. A 2002 paper by researchers at the UK's Defence Science and Technology Laboratory detailed the results of their trace analysis of extracts of clothing and urine from survivors of the siege, identifying that the aerosol used comprised a mixture of two opioid anesthetics, carfentanil and remifentanil. Next slide, please. Thanks. In our investigation, we found that following the Moscow siege, Russian researchers had continued work of potential application to the study or development of Cnsac weapons. This included computer modeling of so-called carminative gas flows in enclosed spaces. In addition, the 2012 UK paper and our own study uncovered research relating to synthesis of fentanyl precursors and the study of opiate receptors and their interaction with potential Cnsacs, detailed in a range of Russian papers from 2005 till at least 2012. We sought clarification of our findings from the Russian authorities, but received no response. Next slide again, Leanne, please. And the US has repeatedly raised concerns in its reports of state CWC compliance. In its most recent report of April 2021, it stated that Russia has a pharmaceutical-based agent PBA, they call it, program intended for purposes inconsistent with the Chemical Weapons Convention. A second state, Israel, reportedly used a non-aerosolized Cnsac weapon at least once. In 1997, Israeli security services used a transdermal Cnsac weapon, apparently employing fentanyl, in either a failed assassination attempt or a kidnapping that went wrong. And the target was a Hamas leader, then resident in Jordan. Israel apparently conducted research in potentially relevant areas, but there's insufficient publicly available information to assess the nature and purpose of such research. Next slide, please. Our investigations also highlighted the development and marketing by two Chinese state-owned companies of Cnsac dart gun weapons employing an unknown anesthetic agent, specially promoted for use by security forces against individuals. We found evidence of the possession of such weapons in 2011 by the Chinese People's Liberation Army. And China has provided no public information regarding stockpiles of these weapons, nor the specific purposes of their intended employment. And nor has it made any statement clarifying whether any Chinese entity has conducted or is conducting research activities related to the development of Cnsac weapons targeting groups. Next slide, please. In April of this year, the US reported that Scientists at a Chinese military institute have expressed interest in military applications of pharmaceutical-based agents and are engaged in research involving the synthesis, characterization, and testing of PBAs with potential dual-use applications. Next slide again, please. We also examined potentially relevant dual-use chemical and life science research conducted from 1997 onwards in a number of countries, including the Czech Republic, India, Iran, the UK, and the US. In certain countries, it's been difficult utilizing publicly available information alone to establish the nature and purpose of the research, i.e., was the research for medical or veterinary purposes, or was it for protective purposes, which are expressly permitted under the Chemical Convention, or was it alternatively intended for Cnsac weapons development? Whilst we received no responses from China, Israel, or Russia, the 5 states I just mentioned did engage with us in substantive correspondence to clarify the purposes of the research we discovered. In the Czech Republic, for example, we found a wealth of papers published between 2005 and 2007 detailing research on opioids, ketamine, medetamine, midazolam, and in some of these academic papers, the researchers themselves specifically highlight the potential utility of these Cnsacs as, in their own words, pharmacological non-lethal weapons. Research into these chemicals, including induction of immobilization in orangutans and chimpanzees, continued till at least 2012. The scientists also investigated alternative means of agent delivery, including conjunctival, nasal, transbuccal, sublingual, and transdermal administration on cats, rabbits, and monkeys, and inhalation administration, which was initially tested on rats and then on human volunteers. The Czech CWC National Authority investigated these activities and concluded that there was no connection between the research and creation of any sort of weapons or devices which could be used for military or police purposes. Next slide, please. In India, scientists at the Defence Research Development Organization have conducted research related to the synthesis, aerosolization, and bioefficacy of fentanyl and its analogues, as described in papers from 2005 till 2020. In 2014, the Indian CWC National Authority gave, and I quote, categorical and unambiguous clarification that India has no stockpile of Cnsacs, is not involved in the weaponization of Cnsacs, and that research on fentanyl is being carried out only for the purpose of protection, as permitted under the CWC. A separate issue of concern has been the practice of narco-analysis, whereby Indian law enforcement officials have conducted Cnsac facilitated interrogations after prisoners submitted to intravenous injection of a barbiturate, sodium thiopental, administered by medical personnel. Next slide, please, Leanne. Another country where scientists have conducted potentially applicable dual-use research has been Iran, as detailed in our 2014 report. In April 2021, the US reported that some of Iran's military controlled facilities, including Imam Hussein University, research chemicals that have a wide range of incapacitating effects. And the US report also stated in 2014, IHU's chemistry department sought kilogram quantities of medetamine, a sedative it has researched as an incapacitant, from Chinese exporters. The US concluded that Iran's work on PBAs raises serious concerns that Iran is pursuing these agents for offensive purposes. Next slide, please. Thanks. The final country I'd like to raise is the US, the United States. The US developed wide area dispersal Cnsac weapons containing BZ in the 1960s. There are no confirmed reports of their use in armed conflict, and all stockpiles were destroyed in the late 1980s and early 1990s. The US did subsequently conduct research into Cnsac weapons for both military and law enforcement purposes prior to and after the coming into force of the CWC. The US apparently researched the potential of Cnsac weapons targeting individuals and groups, but there is no evidence of any development or production of such Cnsac weapons. In 2000, sorry, next slide, please. Thanks, Leanne. These are some more information about that research. And the next slide as well, please. Thank you. In 2013, the US publicly stated that it was not developing, producing, stockpiling, or using Cnsac weapons, and has publicly repeated such declarations in OPCW meetings. And there is no evidence of any subsequent US Cnsac weapons development. There have been subsequent US media reports of enforced Cnsac injection by paramedics at police request in certain US states to control or sedate agitated prisoners, though the circumstances in a number of cases are contested. In July 2020, the American Society of Anesthesiologists publicly opposed such practices. Next slide, please. Thanks. So in conclusion, to summarize our findings, there is evidence of development and use of an aerosolized law enforcement Cnsac weapon against large groups in at least one state and possible existing stockpiles in that state. Consequently, we recommend, for the reasons raised previously, that the CWC states should collectively prohibit development, acquisition, and use of such aerosolized Cnsac weapons, require reporting and verifiable destruction of all existing weapons stockpiles. We've also found that there's been development of non-aerosolized Cnsac law enforcement weapons against individuals and other uses of Cnsacs in law enforcement of contested legitimacy. In the light of this, we believe that CWC states should establish an OPCW process exploring the constraint or prohibition under the CWC and relevant international law, notably international human rights law, of Cnsac or non-Cnsac toxic chemical weapon use in law enforcement. And a useful potential first step in this process could be a review of the existing legal constraints that could be undertaken by the OPCW's Office of the Legal Advisor. And right now, states can and should affirm that their current practice is to restrict use of toxic chemicals for law enforcement to riot control agents alone. Where this is not existing state practice, then states should either make it their policy and practice, or else at a minimum institute a national moratorium on development, acquisition, and use of toxic chemicals other than RCAs for law enforcement until the OPCW process is complete. And finally, potentially relevant dual-use Cnsac research has been identified in a number of states. At a minimum, we believe that all states must fulfill existing CWC reporting obligations. States that are conducting Cnsac research for protective purposes must report their activities in their annual Article 10 declarations. States should also develop additional transparency and confidence building measures in order to provide clarification of the nature and purpose of this dual use research of potential concern, and thereby remove any misconceptions. And finally, the Scientific Advisory Board and the Technical Secretariat of the OPCW should monitor relevant science and technology developments and bring all developments of concern to the attention of the state's parties immediately. And the last slide is just a few references that people might be interested in. Okay, and with that, I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael. So next up, I would like to introduce Dr. Malcolm Dando. Dr. Dando is a Leverhulme Emeritus Fellow at the University of Bradford in the United Kingdom. He trained originally in biology, but has studied arms control and disarmament issues since the 1980s, and particularly the Biological and Toxin Weapons Convention and the Chemical Weapons Convention since the mid-1990s. Most recently, his interest has been in biological security awareness raising and education for life scientists. His latest book was Neuroscience and the Problem of Dual Use, Neuroethics in the New Brain Research Projects. Malcolm, the floor is yours, and I will pull up your slides.
Good afternoon from what counts as a beautiful summer's day in the north of England. As Michael pointed out, we've been investigating these so-called less lethal weapon systems for about 25 years. But I should stress that as we work in the Department of Peace Studies, we are in no way totally opposed to such systems in principle. However, in an early 1996 study, we listed 6 general types of less lethal weapon systems and some 18 different examples within those types. So it was obvious that the advantages and disadvantages would have to be examined for each different type of weapon system and from very diverse perspectives. So I'd like to bring that kind of consideration to my presentation. First of all, very briefly, bringing the kind of arguments that Michael has been presenting into the context of what's happening in the CWC meetings at the present time, but then really concentrating most of what I want to say on my own concerns, which are really about the impact of the developments in science and technology on these possible weapon systems if we don't put some kind of block on them fairly soon. So Leanne, could I have the first slide, please? So at the Executive Council meeting 96, the Russian Federation produced a long and very interesting national paper on these issues. And it started off correctly by pointing out, and as we've heard previously this afternoon, that many other countries were actively involved in developing and thinking about these non-lethal weapon systems based on incapacitating chemicals following the entry into force of the convention. And it refers particularly to the well-known Penn State paper on comatose, which looked through a very wide range of different possible means by which incapacitation could be brought about by these kind of chemicals. Next slide. The paper then goes on to point out that national law enforcement services have to have a range of different methods and means and equipment for their task of meeting very different kinds of situations. And that if you pull one of those methods and means out, then you'll require a revision of law enforcement methods and there will be consequences. And the paper also argues that there's no real alternative to exposure by ethylation for rapid and reversible neutralization of persons, okay? So the argument here is we need these kind of capabilities. This is the only form of capability that fits this particular purpose. Arguments which I'm sure were represented in the discussion over the last couple of decades in countries which have now decided that they do not want to go down that path. Can we have the next slide, please? So what are the arguments being deployed at the OPCW against going down this path? And here's a paper from Australia in 2014, emphasizing the health and safety risks. As Mike has pointed out, there's a very small gap with these agents between the incapacitating and the lethal dose, and you can't control the dosage of the chemical in different parts of a building that you're pumping this stuff into, and you can't predict what kind of response any particular person would have to any particular dose. And therefore, because law enforcement would be forced to come in heavily with large amounts of this stuff, you are almost certain to have casualties, both lethal and long-lasting effects on the nervous system. And again, the Australian paper pointed out the kinds of chemicals that we're talking about. Next slide, please. And then a paper in 2007, statement by the US, points to another big concern here, that maybe some states are deliberately developing these chemicals, not for law enforcement, but for other purposes such as warfare, and disguising these efforts under non-prohibited purposes such as law enforcement. And it has to be said that there is a lot of evidence in the literature that it's very difficult for another state to understand what a state may be doing. Say, in thinking about, well, these chemicals may be used, we'd best think about what kind of countermeasures we need to deal with them. And it's then very difficult for another state to work out, well, are they in fact working on countermeasures, or are they in fact working on the actual chemical systems? Next slide, please. And you have to be clear that these kinds of chemicals can be very, very effective. This is from Ed Regis's book, The Biology of Doom, and it summarizes a Cold War era test of aerosolized staphylococcal enterococcin B, which acts not directly on the nervous system, but acts as a superantigen to the immune system, and therefore indirectly affects and incapacitates through the nervous system. And you can see here that a single plane spreading this stuff in a line and then having it sweep over a target area was calculated to produce about 30% casualties for an unprotected population over a very wide area indeed. So that's summarizing current concerns and discussions. If I could have the next slide, please. My concerns are much more concerned with the future. This is a very well-known paper by Petro and his colleagues from just after the turn of the century. And they were arguing here that about future of mainly biological agents, but the same argument can apply to chemical agents. So they suggested that traditional biological agents would remain a threat, and that genetically modified traditional agents would also increasingly be a threat. But if we go on pressing the button occasionally, Leanne, and again, they suggested then that there would be a shift in the paradigm by which weapons of this type were researched and developed. And the essential point was that as the biotechnology revolution continues, we will expose more and more about how living systems like ourselves operate. And this will mean that there will be more and more understanding of the targets which could be affected, say for good purposes like trying to deal with an illness, or for malign purposes like trying to create some malfunction in the human machine. So this then is a game changer. It changes the balance between defense and switches it more in favor of offense, because if you have multiple new target possibilities and multiple new weapons that might be targeted against those places in the living system, it's very hard to conceive how the defense could catch up. Next slide, please. So this argument can be applied in spades to neuroscience. There is obviously ongoing funding and research in neuroscience for the very good reasons of inquisitive of human beings, but also for helping people with medical problems. But in about 2014, the rate of change in technology capabilities applied to neuroscience was such that big states began to initiate specific brain research initiatives in order to construct something like the scale of the Human Genome Program. So collectively, there's a huge amount of extra money going into neuroscience research. Next slide, please. Now, I could find you a mass of statements of this kind. Basically, what's happened is that the ability to access, assess, and affect very small and simple neuronal systems of the type I worked on 60 years ago in my PhD has now been shifted so that we can do the same kind of things with much more complex neuronal systems, particularly the capabilities that come from our ability to genetically modify organisms and to then study these altered model organisms is such that we're now beginning to get very much better understanding of this circuitry, the brain circuitry, and the targets within the brain circuitry that underlie our thinking, our emotions, and our behavior in general. Next slide, please. It's important to see that these techniques were very first applied to rodents, but rodents are mammals like us, and it's known that many of the basic circuits within our brains are conserved through evolution. So if you can understand a lot about the sleep-wake cycle of rodents, or fear in rodents, or trust in rodents, then you have very good insights into the neuronal circuits that are underlying our sleep-wake cycle, our fear systems. But much more important to my mind is that a lot of the money, particularly in China, Japan's new neuroscience research programs, are devoted to applying the same kind of technologies that we applied successfully in rodents now to genetically modified non-human primates. And therefore, although our systems for complex behavior may be developed more than in non-human primates, you can find out a lot about the underlying circuits that we have by the study of non-human primates. So the old Cold War weaponeers' ideas of being able to do incapacitation right from the top level of thinking right the way through to the basic levels of whether you could stand up or not becomes more and more a possibility in this kind of frame. Next slide, please. And it's important to understand that whilst most of the neuroscientists involved in these endeavors are unlikely to have much knowledge about the Chemical Weapons Convention, the Biological Weapons Convention, or dual use research, some of them do. And this is opinion from some of the people involved in the European Union Human Brain projects, pointing out that whilst people like us may be mainly worried about the military domain, as Michael has pointed out, there are other concerns in the political, security, and intelligence domains if we start going down this road of allowing people to begin to use these kind of weapon systems against our central nervous systems. Next slide, please. So in 2015, 3.5 decades before 2050, an eminent neuroscientist published a very short paper that he put together with some of his colleagues, asking what kind of problems will neuroscience likely to be able to solve by 2050. And I would argue that if you have an understanding of what causes psychiatric and neurological illnesses, how we learn, how our memory works, how we sleep, why we sleep, how we make decisions, you would be well on the way to being able to interfere with those systems. And moreover, I think if the scientist involved was writing this paper today, given the rate of change in our understanding of the nervous system and the rate of change in technological capabilities, he might well be pulling that 2050 date back further towards us. Okay, next slide, please. As Paul, I think, mentioned, Julian was onto this a lot earlier in 2008. And here he's arguing that because of our increasing ability to manipulate at will the processes underlying our human systems, human beings, and because chemical weapons and biological weapons may be particularly powerful in interfering with our operations, he argues it is the potential for changing human beings and doing so in the pursuit of who knows what strategy of aggression that makes CBW uniquely menacing, weapons in the extreme of dehumanization, a risk, therefore, to the whole human species, an existential risk. Next slide, please. And that's why I think the subject we're talking about now is of a really big importance, and doing something about preventing us all going down this road of aerosolized use of CNS-acting chemicals and whatever follows on from that is very important. And therefore, part one of the decision that should be taken hopefully later this year at the Conference of State Parties is very important. But to my mind, part two in the next slide please. Part two is even more important, because if we can get this through, then the Director General has the capability to task the Science Advisory Board to keep a monitor on what's going on in this area and to help provide updates as appropriate, so that we would have some mechanism by which attention could be paid by the Scientific Advisory Board to this issue and to keep state parties regularly updated on what's going on. And finally, my last slide is just to say that if you want details of this argument, they're available in this book, which I published last year. Thank you very much.
So at this point, if I could ask all of you to turn on your videos, and Paul, would you like to take it away for the question and answer section?
Great, thank you very much, Leanne, and thank you too very much to Michael and Malcolm. Really very thorough and I think very interesting, and in some ways very troubling explanation of what's been going on. We have a number of questions. I have a number of questions myself too. We've had before the series, and we've had questions come in during the discussion too. But let me first pose to you both, and maybe start with Malcolm. The Scientific Advisory Board, which is I think over what we call the SAB of the SAB, has been very useful over time. And there's discussions of even creating a similar group, I think, for the Biological Weapons Convention, which at this point doesn't exist. But you finished, Malcolm, a bit with the recommendations the SAB had to keep the states parties and the technical secretariat really up to date on this, what Julian called existential threat or issue. And I'm wondering if you could explain a little bit more about what the Scientific Advisory Board should do. And this year, when the OPCW is considering, will no doubt consider this at the next conference of states parties, is it adequate just to ask the Scientific Advisory Board to keep everyone update, or should we really pass this draft decision banning to some extent CNSAC for non-prohibited uses in riot control?
I'm sorry if I gave the impression that I thought two could go through without one. I see them as both together. But what I tend to hear when people are talking is they're talking about the first part of the decision, and the second part is not much discussed. And I was trying to say both, please. We need both the first part and the second part together. I don't know whether Michael would.
Michael, do you want to add anything to that at all? You're muted.
So yeah, I'm unmuting. Yeah, so absolutely agree. I personally, I think, as I said in my concluding points, I think we need to address the aerosolized Cnsac weapons, and I understand why this EC decision and hopefully CSP resolution solely addresses the aerosolized form, because that's what states consider the most immediate type of weapons of concern. But so, I fully support that initiative, but I think and I think it's important that you get the message across right now at the CSP that such weapons development, stockpiling and use is prohibited under the CWC, and therefore that states need to report any existing stockpiles and verifiably destroy existing stockpiles, and that no further development and use should occur. I think that's very, very important. My concern is, like Malcolm, that states will just end there and won't look at other toxic chemicals, excluding riot control agents, other toxic chemicals that may affect other parts of the body, other body systems. They wouldn't be covered under this resolution, and the non-aerosolized weapons wouldn't be covered either. And we found dart guns and and research about the use of projectiles to deliver such chemicals. So they wouldn't be covered under all that research and development. And if there are weapons, stockpiles wouldn't be covered, and use wouldn't be covered under a resolution. So I think it's important to address all those as well. And then, as Malcolm says, there's a real need for the OPCW to seriously monitor and investigate life and chemical science trajectories more broadly, because there's a greater and greater ability to manipulate the various physiological systems of humans, and the OPCW and also the BTWC states parties and the ISU need to sort of take a holistic approach to monitoring and addressing such advances.
Yeah, thank you both for good answers to that. I mean, I think one issue too, which I'll raise, is what impact would all this have on the BWC or the BTWC, the Biological and Toxin Weapons Convention? I mean, there's discussion, there has been for several years, about bringing the Chemical Weapons Convention and the Biological Weapons Convention closer together, and in fact engaging in more dialogue between both. But there's such a big difference between both, you know, where the OPCW is 450 odd individuals, and the technical secretary, and a budget of 75 million euros, and the BWC has a staff of 3, sometimes less than that, oftentimes, and a budget of 1.5 million euros, something in that range. So the BWC is really a paper organization with no scientific advisory board, and really a very informal, you know, advisory capacity, and not even enough money to travel. Are we really talking about engaging the BWC as well in CNSAC chemicals in this whole issue? Malcolm? Yeah.
Yeah, there are some similarities between the problems facing the CWC and the BWC. And one of them, I'm most familiar with, is the fact that most of the practicing life scientists, and I suspect many of the practicing chemists, don't have a clue about the problem of dual use.
Mm-hmm.
That they are pursuing, quite rightly and properly, benignly intended work, but within their concept of responsible conduct of research, biological security in the sense of dual use, the fact that their work may be misused by others in the future, doesn't exist. Now, I'm not saying we have a systematic survey of what people know about this in the life sciences and in the chemical sciences, but all the information we have, all the ad hoc information we have, strongly suggests that most practicing life scientists don't know anything.
That was probably your wife
not the
that's
child
mentioning it,
with the
right?
romper coming
Child with a walking frame.
It's tea time in England, right? So there you go.
So most of the people there don't really have very much understanding of these issues.
Yeah.
And we don't have anything like the International Nuclear Security Education Network, which is pulling all this information together. We do have the Advisory Board on Education and Outreach in the CWC, but that's some way away from the capabilities of the International Nuclear Security Education Network. And we have practically nothing, as you say, in the BWC, but they both have the same problem. And what we're beginning to see now is some efforts by civil society, people like ourselves, to connect up with people worrying about chemical security education and us worrying about biological security education. And there is a big development, hopefully, which will happen in the BWC at the next review conference, and that they will have a aspirational ethical code of conduct, something like the Hague Ethical Guidelines, and that will have a very strong emphasis on the need for education. So that what we may be able to begin to see is a joint effort by people involved in the Advisory Board on Education and Outreach and other people like ourselves, trying to put together proper core courses for university level people, at least, which incorporate chemical security and biological security within their idea of responsible conduct of research.
Yeah, Michael, did you want to add anything there?
Yeah, just very briefly, because I'm no way an expert on the BTWC at all. But I just wanted to say that, Paul, yeah, you're absolutely right. The immediate responsibility for dealing with this issue, I'd say, CNS-acting weapons lies with the OPCW, because the sort of huge majority of toxic chemicals explored at the moment are toxic chemicals, pharmaceutical chemicals, and that fits absolutely squarely within the scope of the CWC. But there are potentially other sorts of agents that could be used for these types of weapons, including bioregulators, toxins, which also they come under the scope of the CWC, but those two categories also come under the BTWC as well. Right. So it is, and if you can weaponize these things, then that will be a concern of the states parties to the BTWC, because any development of such weapons will undermine the credibility and the objects and goals of the BTWC. So it's an immediate concern for CWC states parties, but BTWC states parties also needs to address the issue, especially when it comes to monitoring of science and technology in these areas, and also to lay down sort of normative guidance saying that this sort of development is against the BTWC. So of course recognize the limitations in resources, but I think red lines, clarity and red lines have to be enunciated by the BTWC states parties. I also, just backing up what Malcolm says about the interconnection between the life sciences and the chemical sciences, and with regards to dual use, there's also, when it comes to toxin and bioregulator monitoring, there is the potential for the SAB and the Technical Secretariat of the OPCW to do that monitoring and provide that information on toxins and bioregulators and peptides, anything that it sees of concern, to provide that information to the ISU and the states parties of the BTWC. So a greater information sharing between both technical secretariats or technical bodies would be useful, and also a greater information sharing and synergy between civil society organizations, the life and life science and chemical associations, and also the state officials monitoring these areas can be made, I think.
Great. I'm so glad to hear you both also mention the importance of public outreach and civil society involvement in the industry and the scientific communities too. I mean, we've all emphasized this over time, I know, and about a decade ago we came to create the CWC coalition, but it seems like certainly when I talk to many scientists here in the United States and elsewhere, most of them are not at all aware of either the CWC or the BWC. And I was actually talking to somebody just a day ago about use of pepper spray. Actually, he's involved in law enforcement purposes here in the United States. And I said, do you realize there are any restrictions on, that the pepper spray is obviously an allowed riot control agent on RCA. And I said, have you ever heard of the Chemical Weapons Convention? He said, absolutely not. No, never heard of it. Didn't know what it was. So I think what we're all trying to do through these webinars, but also through our CWC coalition and all the good work that you all are doing, and many of our listeners I know too, is to try to reach out and publicly educate. And I think this is also part of an important part of the global partnership today too. Malcolm, you had your hand up, your two finger there, or whatever. Yeah.
I think we've got to become very much more imaginative in the way we try to explain these issues to scientists and the general public. We've just had a really good, interesting short project in which we developed 5 two-page cartoons to explain biological security issues. And we worked with some professional cartoonists in Greece, did them in English, and then we contacted friends all over the world and got them all of the cartoons translated into 13 different languages. And these are cartoons which try to encapsulate some of the key issues in biological security, with a little bit of humor added in as well. And hopefully they can then be used very, very widely for awareness raising and educational purposes. And it's not too difficult then to think, well, why don't you animate? So why don't you have some things on YouTube which are animations trying to explain these issues and what's at stake to a much wider audience than we usually talk to?
And I think the OPCW, certainly the technical secretariat, is seeking to do a lot of that as well. You'll notice there's a lot more just in the last few years on YouTube and short, I think very straightforward background videos and discussions of a variety of these issues. But I completely agree. A lot of it's very technical, even over the heads of many scientists, because it's not their field. And we all get caught up in the alphabet soup, of here we are trying to pronounce CNS, AC, whatever, Cnsac, whatever. No one has any idea, let alone RCA and ICA and all the rest. We have a bunch of questions that have come in, and we have some even prior, and I think we've covered some of that already. But this is a let me go to a couple of these anyway, and I'll try to combine some of them too. This is a question actually from a colleague in Australia. It says, if the decision regarding CNS-acting chemicals is passed at the upcoming Conference of States Parties, how will this decision impact CNSAC's research and development? So which of you would like to respond to that?
Yeah, well, I can start, and then Malcolm
Michael,
can jump in. Yeah, it's a good question. I think it all depends, and this is a rubbish answer, of course, but it all depends on the wording of the CSP resolution that's agreed. If it's based on the existing EC decision, then it will clarify that all use of aerosolized Cnsacs for law enforcement is inconsistent with purposes not prohibited, and hence weaponized Cnsacs and the dispersal mechanisms and the munitions will be considered as chemical weapons, and then flowing from that, they will need to be declared and stockpiles verifiably destroyed. But as I sort of mentioned earlier, I think a lot more work needs to be done right now by those states supporting this initiative before we get to the CSP. And this, this gets to some of the points raised by the Russians in their paper and by other states as well. Some of these are legitimate questions. So firstly, we keep talking about Cnsacs, central nervous system acting chemicals, but they're not defined anywhere. They're not defined in the EC decision. So, for states to actually vote on this or decide, to go ahead with this decision at the CSP, there needs to be a definition of the chemicals that we're talking about. What does Cnsac, the aerosolized use of Cnsacs for law enforcement mean? What's law enforcement in this issue? What do Cnsacs mean? And it would be also good, of course, to have an indicative list of the chemicals that we're concerned about. Now, I know that we can't, perhaps it's impossible to have that ready, a list ready for the CSP, but the CSP can initiate a process to develop such a list of chemicals. So I think that's important. So it's important for the states who want this to engage now with and develop their thinking and guidance in the run-up to the CSP. Also, I think thought needs to be given to the implications for the verification regime, not least revising the schedules of chemicals annexed to the convention in order to facilitate the verification measures. At the moment, only BZ and a couple of its immediate precursors are listed under schedule, I think Schedule 2. So again, once this decision is agreed, if it's agreed, then all these mechanisms need to be worked through. We've had a change to the schedules over Novichok's, so it shows that schedules can be changed if the states parties deem it necessary. But states supporting this initiative need to think about this and have answers ready when people ask these legitimate questions. Also, to respond to the initial part of the question, research in Cnsacs and legitimate use of Cnsacs, for medical and for veterinary purposes, that cannot be detrimentally affected by the decision. So the wording of the resolution should ensure that that is the case. And also, it would be good to develop, as I sort of proposed, the idea of increased transparency and confidence building measures to allow states to show that their research in this area is not for weapons development. Yeah, okay, I think that's it. That's my initial response to it.
Yeah, thanks, Michael. Malcolm, do you want to add, or? You're mute.
All of the above, but something more interesting as well. Mike's saying that getting this decision through should, or in the process, trigger a lot of activity amongst states parties trying to work this issue through. As Mike said, it won't affect, as far as I can see, anybody doing peaceful research anyway. But what it may do is to signal to those people doing benignly intended research that there's something else that they need to worry about, and that's the misuse of their research. So by doing this and making it clear, it could help to trigger that change in the culture of the life and associated sciences, so that you get a different conception of responsible conduct of research.
Yeah, and I think that's important to point out. I mean, if people read the Chemical Weapons Convention, it does not ban research. And that was a major, discussion when the Chemical Weapons Convention was being negotiated in the 1980s and early 90s. So basic scientific research is not prohibited, but it also promotes, transparency, and I think we have to continue to work on that and confidence building measures so that people have confidence in what people are doing, and that there's no, this is also the case with nuclear weapons, of course, and fissile materials with the safeguards program under the IAEA. Let me go on. We have many, as I say, many questions. We were obviously not going to get to them all. There's a question from Mexico, a colleague in Mexico saying, is there a future for the effective control of riot control agents? And of course, we're really not talking today about riot control agents, but they're a close, kissing cousin, I guess, to ICAs and CNS. Or will the OPCW continue to keep these aside? I mean, obviously they're not prohibited, so we're talking mostly tear gas and pepper spray and things of that nature. Is there any impact? Would there be any impact if we limit CNSACs on riot control agents, or some overlapping definition? And Malcolm, why don't you go first?
I just wanted to say, I think there is a very intimate link that is not usually exposed, and something that Mike has worked on a great deal, and that's the problem of delivery systems and the evolution of capabilities to deliver large quantities of riot control agents over large areas. Essentially means if you change the agent, you've got something very, very different, and perhaps Mike would want to say a little bit about that.
Yeah, Malcolm, thanks. You've taken most of the words out of my mouth as normal. Yeah, what I wanted to say, well, firstly, to recognise the importance of the question itself. So Bradford and Omega have worked together, for many years, and also with human rights organizations, to highlight the widespread misuse of RCA's riot control agents by law enforcement officials throughout the world, both in policing protests, so public order, assemblies, and their misuse in prisons and places of detention. So I think, that problem is a huge problem. And we've argued that this misuse, in many cases, obviously contravenes international human rights law and standards, but in certain cases does contravene the Chemical Weapons Convention, particularly in cases where RCAs are used in enclosed spaces or in high concentrations. There is a danger to health and can be fatal. And they turn from being riot control agents as allowed under the convention to being, de facto toxic weapons that can seriously affect people's health, or, as I said, kill them. And of course, they are allowed in for law enforcement, provided the types and quantities are consistent with that purpose. But when they're not consistent with that purpose, then they become prohibited practices, I'd argue. Right. I personally believe that the OPCW and the CWC states parties haven't given RCAs the time and space and importance that it deserves. So I would sort of support the perceived intention behind the questioner. But going back to what Malcolm was saying, we've worked, Omega and Bradford have looked at the existing means of delivery of RCAs, but also the contemporary development by both state entities and commercial companies of a growing range of what we call wide area and remote control RCA delivery mechanisms. And these include multiple projectile launchers, delivery mechanisms mounted on unmanned ground vehicles and on drones, large caliber munitions. And these have been promoted for the dissemination of RCAs. But as Malcolm said, these means of delivery, some of these means of delivery can be, in theory, turned into delivery mechanisms for Cnsac weapons and also for other chemical weapons. And this issue was in fact raised at the last review conference of the Chemical Weapons Convention in 2018 by the Scientific Advisory Board, who warned that the availability of certain of these systems opens up the possibility that they could be filled intentionally with alternate types of chemicals, including chemical warfare agents or CNS-acting compounds. So this is sort of an intersection where delivery devices promoted for RCA dispersal over wide areas could be misused for CNS, for dispersing CNS-AC weapons over wide areas as well. So again, this is another reason why the whole issue of RCAs and their delivery mechanisms needs to be addressed by the OPCW. Thanks.
Thank you, Malcolm. Malcolm.
Just a comment here. The nightmare we're trying to avoid is down the line, a couple of decades down the line, chemical and biological weapon systems become commonplace. The erosion of the regimes by this means, and another means, in the kind of context of the wars that are going on at the present time, eventually leads you to a situation where instead of having the norm being that you don't use these kind of weapons, the norm is broken. And that on the back of very rapid escalation of our understanding of the science and technology. That's the real problem that we're trying to deal with. So each of these little issues of erosion needs to be understood in that general context. If we let this one go, then something else is going to go next, and we need to keep our eyes on all of it.
Yeah, I mean, I think everyone, Michael, go ahead. Yeah.
No, I just wanted to plug two reports that if people are interested in wide area or remote control RCA mechanisms or whatever of concern, that Omega and Bradford brought out two reports which are available on the internet. So one's called Tear Gassing by Remote Control, and the other one's called Drawing the Line. So yeah, if people are interested, then they can just, click a button.
Yeah, I actually remember when we had our former president clear Lafayette Square of protesters that were peacefully protesting. This is probably a year ago or so. There was the whole question about use of tear gas and who actually used it. And I was actually at the time raising that question, whether it was used by law enforcement or in fact by the military, that in fact was in the end I think was called in. But it appears now that it was used by law enforcement. But there is a clear line that riot control agents are usable only by law enforcement, not by military forces, if I'm not mistaken, under the CWC. Michael.
Yeah, under the CWC, riot control agents can't be used as a method of warfare, so they can't be used in armed conflict. And of course, they can be used for law enforcement, but law enforcement can be undertaken by, obviously by police, but military forces can undertake law enforcement in certain circumstances. So in those circumstances, as long as they are carrying out law enforcement duties, in theory, they can use riot control agents. But of course, there's big dangers about that, because if they are occupying forces, trying to carry out law enforcement, then a situation can turn very quickly from one of law enforcement to armed conflict. So that's a very difficult situation. But when military forces are carrying out law enforcement, I think that they can use riot control agents for those law enforcement purposes. But minds far wiser than mine will probably disagree or whatever. But anyway, that's
well, I think one of the points you're both making is that there's not a clear red line in all of these definitions, and there's a gray area open to interpretation all the time. We only have about 5 minutes left, right, Leanne, I think, but let me raise a couple of related questions that have come in as well. One is about the, I think probably relates back to the Dubrovka, use of a fentanyl derivative or a fentanyl type CNS-acting back in 2002. And the question is, if we in fact ban these central nervous system acting chemicals, what's the option for counter-terrorist forces in an example like the Dubrovka theater, in which hundreds of people were taken hostage with heavily armed terrorists, and in this case, Chechen terrorists. Are there other potentially non-lethal options that could be used? I mean, I think there's a real worry, and some of the state parties have stated this, I think, in some of the working documents before the Executive Council and the OPCW, that we don't want to take away, all options. And I also remember this was an argument that some Americans and some Russians used years ago, probably 30 years ago, about the taking away ladders on the, rungs on the ladder of escalation, so we didn't have to go to nuclear war, that we needed chemical weapons to be used as a less than nuclear option. And I think this sort of relates to that. Are there really, will there be options, in fact, or could emergency use, be used if absolutely necessary in counter-terrorist or similar operations? Malcolm or Michael? Malcolm, okay.
Let me go first, and then
Yeah.
Mike might want to come in. The point I would make is that these arguments have been had out seriously within major states, who have decided that, despite the problem that the Russian paper shows us quite clearly, they decided that the advantages of going down that line were outweighed by the disadvantages, albeit that it causes problems. And I think it's that kind of evidence-based pragmatic decisions that we need to encourage other states as best we can to think through as well. So yes, it's a problem, but that problem has been confronted by a number of states, and they've decided not to go down this road.
And Michael, do you want to?
Yeah, firstly, I think we all have to recognize that the Russians were in an incredibly difficult, just terrible situation, and they were trying to deal with it as best they could. So, it's an impossible situation. And but just underlying what Malcolm said, states who have explored this issue have walked away from this issue. What happened in Moscow showed that over 100 people died because of this, and it could have been more, it could have been less, but a sizable proportion of the people you are trying to save die from your use in it. And you can do counterfactual arguments. What if this had happened? Then it would have been successful. But then you can also do other counterfactual arguments. If the CNS-acting chemical weapon didn't act quickly enough, and if they had explosives and they pressed it, then everybody could have died. So it's an impossible situation. But states have walked. Many states who have explored this area have said no. We can't develop these weapons which will provide a silver bullet, a miracle gas that immediately knocks everybody out safely. That's just not scientifically possible. And when you develop these weapons, there's just a huge possibility of opening up doors for malign use by security forces in your country, the state that's developing, but also in other states as well, and non-state actors. So when you open Pandora's box, the consequences far outweigh the potential benefits.
I think I know we're out of time, but I would just end by saying you both did wonderful, extremely understandable presentations, and I congratulate you both on your ongoing and very important work. I think we're all supportive of trying to come to some sort of agreement in the OPCW in The Hague in the coming months. And one of the important points you both make, I think, is that these abolition multilateral agreements are really living documents in a way. They're not simply meant to destroy and verify, declared stockpiles, as I think certain state parties actually would argue. But they're living documents to try to build and strengthen the norm against the use of these unacceptable weapons. So I think this would be a great step forward, but I'm sure it's not going to be ended in 2021. These will be issues that will carry on, fortunately, and make actually a lot of this work very interesting for a lot of us. So with that, I thank you both. I also apologize to any of the listeners who haven't had their questions answered. We had many, many questions, but I think I included a good number of them in our discussion. I also want to thank the Arms Control Association, and particularly Leanne Quinn, who works closely with me, and we couldn't have done this webinar without her. And also Tony Fleming, who is in the background, but is kind of our go-to tech guru who has helped enormously in all of these webinars, and the executive director of the Arms Control Association, Daryl Kimball, of course. Thanks to all the viewers for tuning in, and this will be available on the web shortly after we stop. And with that, I'll turn it over to Leanne.
Thank you. So just one more big thank you to Michael and Malcolm for sharing your work today. And thank you to everyone who attended and asked your questions. As Paul said, this webinar has been recorded and will be available shortly on the CWCC website in a day or two. And for any colleagues that were registered but didn't attend, they will receive a recording in an email form shortly as well. So CWCC will continue its efforts to introduce timely and important subjects over the coming months. So stay tuned for future webinars, especially as we work our way towards the 26th Annual Conference of States Parties in The Hague in late November 2021. So thank you very much again, and have a great rest of your day. Bye-bye.